Easter Island and you look at the sites there, the statues, the megalithic walls, you realise they're much older than what history tells us.
For centuries, Easter Island has been one of the greatest unsolved mysteries on Earth. Giant stone heads stare silently across the landscape, their builders unknown, their purpose endlessly debated. But now, everything we thought we knew may be wrong. Archaeologists have uncovered evidence of a hidden structure buried deep beneath the island, something deliberately concealed, something never meant to be found. This isn't just another tunnel or forgotten chamber. Early data suggests it was carefully engineered, sealed, and aligned with the island's most sacred monuments. The discovery hints that the famous Moai statues were only the surface layer of a much larger, more advanced system. A system that suggests the island's ancient inhabitants possess knowledge far beyond what historians ever credited them with. If confirmed, this find could rewrite the story of Easter Island, who built it, why they built it, and what they were trying to protect beneath the stone. Hit like and subscribe before we reveal what they found. For a long time, the world believed a simple story about Easter Island. Giant stone heads stood frozen in the grass, staring blankly into the distance. They looked unfinished, mysterious, even crude, but archaeologists had a quiet suspicion. Something about that story felt incomplete. When researchers finally began digging around the Moai, the truth surfaced. Literally, these weren't just heads planted in the ground. They were full human figures, deliberately buried over time. As layers of soil were removed, shoulders emerged, then chests, then long arms folded carefully across stone torsos. Some statues extended more than 30 feet underground, hidden from view for centuries. This wasn't accidental burial. Nature alone couldn't explain the depth, preservation, or positioning. The earth had protected details no one had ever seen. Intricate carvings etched into the statues' backs. Symbols like spirals and crescents appeared, still sharp, still intentional. These weren't decorations. They were messages, identity markers, lineage signs, cultural codes carved in stone. Even more striking was where the statues faced. Not toward the sea, as many assumed, but inland toward ancient villages. The Moai weren't watching enemies approach. They were watching their people, guardians, ancestors, protectors. Then came the hats, massive red stone cylinders called pukao. Far from cosmetic, they symbolized power and status. The larger the hat, the greater the authority of the person being honored. This revealed a deeply structured society with rank, leadership, and symbolism. Scattered at the statue's feet were stone tools, abandoned as if work had stopped suddenly. It felt frozen in time. The Moai builders weren't primitive laborers. They were master sculptors and planners, capable of long-term projects that blended art, engineering, and belief. The hidden bodies proved one thing beyond doubt. Easter Island was never just about stone heads. It was about an advanced civilization, expressing identity, memory, and protection, buried in plain sight. The mysterious red pigment discovery. For years, Easter Island was used as a cautionary tale, a society that supposedly destroyed its own environment and collapsed into chaos. Once the trees were gone, historians assumed everything else fell apart. But a discovery made in 2011 quietly shattered that narrative. Near the Rongorongo quarry, archaeologists uncovered dozens of underground pits filled with brilliant red pigment, not scattered residue, not accidental stains. These were carefully prepared, deliberately stored caches of color. The pigment was made from hematite and magamite, iron-rich minerals that produced an intense crimson hue. What stunned researchers wasn't just the color, but the timing. The pits dated from 1200 to 1650 CE, centuries after the island's forests had vanished. According to the old story, this shouldn't have been possible. Yet here was proof of planning, craftsmanship, and long-term organization, continuing well into what was thought to be Easter Island's Dark Age. Each pit was lined with stone and sealed with a fitted lid, preserving the pigment so perfectly it looked freshly made. This wasn't waste or leftover material. It was valuable, protected, and clearly meant for future use. That immediately raised the question, why go to such effort? In Polynesian culture, red is not just a color. It represents mana, spiritual power, authority, and life force. Chiefs wore it. Ritual objects were marked with it. Bodies were painted with it during sacred ceremonies. And crucially, the Moai themselves were often coated in red pigment, transforming them from stone monuments into living spiritual presences. The sheer quantity of pigment changed everything. There was enough to paint hundreds of statues, multiple times. That meant people were still gathering resources, coordinating labor, and sustaining religious traditions on a massive scale. This was not a society barely surviving. It was one actively maintaining identity and belief. Physical evidence supports this. Traces of red paint remain on Moai housed in museums today, including Hoa Hakananaya in the British Museum, which was recorded as being richly painted when removed from the island. These weren't rare exceptions. They were part of a larger, island-wide practice. Even more revealing was what the pigment pits implied about social structure. Mining iron oxides, processing them, transporting them, and storing them required leadership and cooperation. This was organized labor, guided by tradition, not desperation. The red pigment discovery forces a rethinking of Easter Island's history. If large-scale ceremonial production was still thriving in the 1600s, then the collapse didn't happen when we thought it did. And if that assumption was wrong, what else have we misunderstood about this island? And what secrets are still waiting underground? The secret underground chambers. For a long time, archaeologists focused almost entirely on what they could see on Easter Island, the towering Moai and the massive stone platforms, called ahu, that held them in place. But as excavations deepened, a hidden world began to emerge beneath those platforms, revealing a side of the island's culture that had been completely invisible for centuries. Buried below several ahu, researchers discovered sealed underground chambers, carefully constructed and deliberately hidden. These were not crude pits or natural caves. They were engineered rooms, built with the same precision stonework used in the Moai themselves. Massive stones were cut and fitted so tightly that they resisted water, earthquakes, and time itself. Whoever built them knew exactly what they were doing, and they intended these chambers to last. Inside, archaeologists found human remains placed with care, surrounded by objects that immediately challenged old assumptions about Easter Island's isolation. Obsidian tools, sharper than steel, lay beside finely crafted shell jewelry sourced from islands thousands of miles away. Carved wooden objects showed artistic traditions passed down through generations. These items weren't everyday belongings. They were symbols of status, connection, and meaning. What became clear was that these chambers were reserved for specific people. Not everyone earned a place beneath the Moai. The individuals buried here were likely chiefs, priests, and master artisans, people whose lives carried spiritual or social weight. Being laid to rest beneath a Moai meant remaining under the watch of the ancestors, protected by stone guardians for eternity. Some chambers revealed something even more telling. Multiple generations of the same family, buried together over centuries. This pointed to powerful bloodlines that held authority and responsibility across time. It also pushed the island's active cultural timeline much further back than expected. Some burials dated to around 1000 CE, proving Easter Island was thriving far earlier and far longer than many historians believed. The engineering behind these chambers was astonishing. Builders had to carve into solid rock, transport heavy stones, assemble them without mortar, and seal everything so completely that the chambers remained intact for hundreds of years. All of this was done beneath active ceremonial platforms, without disturbing the monuments above. It was a feat of planning, secrecy, and cooperation. These discoveries also solved a lingering mystery. Many Ahu platforms have small carved niches that puzzled researchers for decades. The chambers revealed their purpose. They were offering points. Food, water, and valuable objects were placed there for the ancestors buried below, maintaining a living relationship between the dead and the community above. Traces of red pigment inside the chambers tied burial rituals to the same sacred color used on the Moai and in ceremonies across the island. Death, power, ancestry, and spirituality were all woven into one unified system. The underground chambers completely change how Easter Island is understood. This was not a simple society obsessed only with giant statues. It was a deeply organized civilization that honored lineage, engineered in secret, and built monuments both above and below the ground. And if some Ahu hide chambers beneath them, one question remains impossible to ignore. How many more are still buried, waiting to be found? The Coral Eye Revelation. For hundreds of years, the Moai of Easter Island have been described as silent stone giants, massive, expressionless faces, frozen in time. Tourists stood before them and felt mystery, but also distance. The statues looked powerful, yet strangely empty. In 1978, that illusion collapsed. Archaeologist Sergio Rapu noticed something most people had overlooked: fragments of white material scattered near Moai platforms. At first glance, they looked like broken stones, but when examined closely, they told a shocking story. These weren't random fragments. They were pieces of giant coral eyes, eyes that had once been carefully set into the statues' faces. Suddenly, everything made sense. The Moai were never meant to be blank. The carved eye sockets weren't decorative hollows. They were designed to hold eyes that would transform cold stone into something that felt alive. As Rapu's team reconstructed the fragments, they uncovered extraordinary craftsmanship. Each eye was carved from bright white coral, polished to reflect sunlight. At the center sat a pupil made from either black obsidian or red volcanic scoria. When installed, the contrast would have been striking. White eyes with dark, focused pupils that seemed to lock onto the world around them. This discovery changed how archaeologists understood the Moai's placement. The statues weren't positioned randomly. They were aligned, so that sunlight would strike their coral eyes at certain moments of the day, especially during ceremonies. In those moments, the eyes would appear to glow. To the people watching, it would have looked as though the ancestors themselves had awakened. Installing these eyes was no small task. Each Moai had uniquely shaped eye sockets, meaning the eyes were custom-made. Skilled specialists had to carve coral precisely, fit it perfectly, and understand the ritual significance of the act. This wasn't decoration, it was activation. The moment the eyes were installed, the statue became spiritually complete. The coral eyes also revealed something important about the Moai building process. Eyes were added last, only after a statue had been carved, transported across the island, raised onto its platform, and properly positioned. That final step could take years. Only when the eyes were placed did the Moai truly become a guardian. Not every statue received this honor. Archaeological evidence suggests that only the most important Moai, those representing powerful ancestors or placed at sacred sites, were given eyes. This created a hierarchy among the statues, mirroring the social structure of the living community. For generations, local oral traditions spoke of statues that could see, watch, and protect. Outsiders dismissed these stories as legend. But the coral eyes proved the belief was real. When modern researchers recreated the eyes and placed them into a moai, the reaction was immediate and unsettling. The statue no longer felt distant. It felt aware. The moai were never meant to be blind stone monuments. They were meant to watch. The Rongorongo writing mystery. In 1864, French missionary Eugène Hérault noticed something extraordinary in island homes. Wooden tablets carved with rows of strange symbols. They didn't look like decoration. They looked deliberate. The islanders called them Rongorongo, a word tied to chanting and recitation. What Hérault had stumbled upon was something no one expected to find in Polynesia, a native writing system. At first glance, the symbols felt almost alive. Birds, fish, plants, human figures, and abstract shapes marched across the tablets in neat lines. But what truly stunned scholars was how those lines were arranged. The text followed a complex pattern called boustrophodon, where one line reads left to right, the next right to left, flipping direction like an ox plowing a field. This wasn't accidental. It required planning, training, and shared rules, clear signs of an advanced intellectual tradition. Even more puzzling was the number of symbols. There were hundreds of them. Some appeared over and over again, others only rarely. That imbalance hinted at structure, possibly names, titles, numbers, or sacred phrases. This wasn't primitive marking. It was information being recorded. Then came the heartbreak of the discovery. By the time Europeans arrived, very few islanders could still interpret the tablets. Disease, slave raids, and cultural disruption had shattered the chain of knowledge. The elders who remembered Rongorongo were hesitant to teach outsiders, and within a generation, the meaning was largely lost. What makes Rongorongo so astonishing is its uniqueness. Across the vast Pacific, thousands of islands and cultures, Easter Island stands alone. No other Polynesian society developed a written system before European contact. That means Rongorongo wasn't borrowed or copied. It was invented. The tablets themselves deepen the mystery. They were carved with shark teeth and obsidian tools into valuable wood, some from trees that no longer grew on the island. That suggests the tablets were either extremely old or made from rare driftwood carried across oceans. Either way, they were precious. For over 150 years, scholars have tried to crack the code. Some believe Rongorongo records genealogies, preserving bloodlines and ancestral authority. Others think it holds ceremonial chants, astronomical knowledge, or historical events. But one detail stands out. Rongorongo was never meant to be read silently. According to oral accounts, the tablets acted as memory guides. Trained chanters would run their fingers along the symbols while reciting long traditions aloud, stories that could last hours. The writing didn't replace speech, it strengthened it. That combination, written symbols supporting oral memory, is rare in human history. It shows a society deeply invested in preserving knowledge across generations. Rongorongo remains undeciphered, but its existence alone changes everything. It proves Easter Island was not just a land of statues, it was a culture capable of innovation, abstraction, and intellectual breakthroughs found nowhere else on Earth. The Birdman cult, archaeological evidence. By the time archaeologists began carefully excavating the windswept cliffs of Orongo, it was already clear they were looking at something very different from the world of the Moai. What they uncovered revealed not a slow cultural drift, but a sudden and dramatic religious revolution, one that reshaped Easter Island society from the ground up. Sometime around 1400 CE, everything changed. The carving of Moai stopped almost overnight. Half-finished statues were left abandoned in the quarries as if the island simply walked away from a tradition that had defined it for centuries. In its place emerged a new belief system centered on a powerful and unsettling figure, the Birdman, a hybrid of human and bird linked to divine authority. The heart of this transformation was Orongo, a ceremonial village perched precariously on the rim of the Rongorongo volcano. Archaeologists uncovered 53 low stone houses, unlike anything seen elsewhere in Polynesia. Built with a rare corbelled roofing technique, these structures weren't meant for daily life. They were temporary shelters, used during the island's most intense and dangerous annual ritual. Carved into the surrounding rocks were hundreds of petroglyphs, birdmen with hooked beaks, figures of Make the creator god, and scenes of ritual power. These weren't casual carvings. They were deliberate, symbolic records etched into hard basalt using stone tools meant to endure. The ceremony itself was brutal. Each year, clan representatives competed to retrieve the first egg of the sooty tern from Motu Nui, a small island surrounded by treacherous, shark-filled waters. Archaeological finds at Orongo, broken eggshells, bird bones, stone tools, map out the preparation and aftermath of this ordeal. Obsidian blades and spear points hint at violence, rivalries, and deadly conflict over access to the nesting grounds. Victory changed everything. The sponsor of the winning competitor became the Birdman, gaining control over resources and political power for the entire year. Leadership was no longer inherited. It was earned through risk, endurance, and what was believed to be divine favor. This marked a complete restructuring of society. The old system honored ancestors through permanent monuments. The Birdman cult focused on renewal, competition, and survival in a harsher world. Power shifted from the past to the present, from stone guardians to living champions. Environmental stress may have fueled this change. As resources dwindled, ancestral authority may have lost its grip. The Birdman ritual offered a new logic for leadership, one suited to scarcity and uncertainty. Even more intriguing, similar Birdman imagery appears elsewhere in Polynesia, suggesting Easter Island wasn't turning inward, but reaching back outward, reconnecting spiritually with a wider Pacific world. Orongo stands as proof that Easter Island did not simply decline. It adapted dramatically and decisively, closing one chapter of its history and opening another, written in feathers, risk, and power. The DNA and population revelations. For a long time, Easter Island was held up as a warning to the world. A society that supposedly destroyed its environment, turned on itself, and collapsed into violence. That story was repeated in textbooks, documentaries, and classrooms for decades, but recent breakthroughs in DNA analysis and archaeology have quietly overturned almost all of it. When scientists began studying ancient bones from archaeological sites across the island, the genetic evidence told a completely different story. Instead of signs of starvation, mass violence, or population crashes, the DNA showed stability. Families persisted. Lineages continued. The population remained healthy and organized for centuries, right up until Europeans arrived in 1722. Archaeological sites backed this up. Settlements dated from 1200 CE through the 1600s showed no evidence of widespread warfare or societal breakdown. Crops were still being grown. Ceremonial sites were maintained. Communities were structured and functioning. The islanders weren't collapsing. They were adapting. The real catastrophe came later, and it came from the outside. Historical records and archaeological layers align on one horrifying truth. Between the 1700s and late 1800s, Easter Island's population fell from around 3,000 people to just 111 survivors. A 96% collapse, not over centuries, but in barely 150 years. The cause wasn't ecological failure. It was disease and slavery. European illnesses like smallpox and tuberculosis tore through the population, killing entire families who had no natural immunity. But the most devastating blow came in the 1860s, when Peruvian slave traders raided the island. Archaeologists can see this moment clearly in the soil. Villages suddenly abandoned, tools left behind, homes never returned to. More than 1,400 islanders, nearly half the population, were captured and forced into slavery in South America. Most died within months. Those few who survived and were eventually returned carried smallpox back with them, triggering an epidemic that finished what the raids had started. Mass graves and hurried burials mark this period of absolute collapse. DNA evidence from modern Rapa Nui descendants reveals something extraordinary. Despite losing almost everyone, the survivors rebuilt their community from within. They preserved their Polynesian identity, passing it down through generations rather than losing it through outside absorption. But the cost was enormous. With so few elders left alive, entire bodies of knowledge vanished in a single generation. Rongorongo writing faded. Moai building techniques were forgotten. Ceremonial traditions went silent, not because the culture failed, but because its teachers were gone. This also explains long-standing mysteries, the abandoned quarries, the scattered tools, the fallen statues. These weren't signs of ancient collapse. They were the fingerprints of a 19th century disaster. Modern science has rewritten Easter Island's story. It is not a lesson about self-destruction. It is a story of endurance, identity, and survival in the face of overwhelming external devastation. The modern archaeological revolution. For most of the last century, archaeologists on Easter Island were limited by what they could physically dig, see, and touch. Today, that limitation is gone. A quiet technological revolution is transforming how the island is studied, and it's revealing a hidden world beneath the surface that no one knew existed. Modern tools like ground-penetrating radar allow researchers to see underground without lifting a single stone. These scans have already detected dozens of buried structures, walls, platforms, and chambers lying beneath the soil. Each signal on the radar screen hints at human activity waiting to be uncovered, expanding the map of Easter Island far beyond what's visible today. From space, the story grows even bigger. Satellite imagery has exposed faint outlines of ancient roads, farming systems, and abandoned settlements that are nearly impossible to spot on foot. What once looked like empty land is now understood as a carefully managed landscape. Terraced fields, stone boundaries, and pathways reveal an island shaped deliberately by human hands. Easter Island wasn't sparsely inhabited, it was organized, engineered, and alive with activity. On the ground, 3D laser scanning has changed how the Moai are studied. Every groove, carving mark, and weathered edge is digitally captured in extreme detail. These scans preserve the statues permanently, allowing researchers to analyze them without risking damage. Scholars can now compare carving styles, identify individual sculptors' techniques, and track how artistic traditions evolved over time. One of the most impactful efforts is the ongoing Easter Island Statue Project, which continues to excavate buried Moai and document their full forms. Each excavation reveals something new: carved backs, symbolic markings, and construction details hidden for centuries. Over 150 statues have already been studied in depth, and hundreds more remain underground, untouched. Technology is also answering long-debated questions about how the Moai were moved and raised. Computer simulations and engineering models test theories using physics, terrain data, and archaeological evidence. Instead of guessing, researchers can now demonstrate what was possible and what wasn't, showing that ancient islanders used clever, efficient methods rather than brute force. When all these tools are combined, a completely new picture of Easter Island emerges. The old narrative of isolation and collapse no longer fits. What we see instead is a society that innovated, adapted to change, and maintained cultural identity under immense pressure. And this revolution is just beginning. With new technologies developing every year, buried sites still undisturbed, and countless Moai yet to be revealed, Easter Island remains one of the most promising archaeological frontiers on Earth. What's shocking isn't what's been lost, but how much still survives beneath the surface, waiting to be understood.